Welcome, Bourbon Real Talk Plus members. Randy Sullivan coming to you with a special piece of bonus content. Recently, I traveled to Ohio and also Kentucky, and when I was in Kentucky, I met up with my friend Brad Bonds, who owns Revival Spirits. I believe it's revivalspiritsky.com is his website. But anyway, in Covington, Kentucky, he has a vintage spirit store. And one time, a while back ago, somebody reached out to me and said that they had inherited a bunch of old bottles that were unopened and what should they do with them. And I said, if you want to legally sell them, you need to get in contact with Brad Bonds. It took him over a year, but he did acquire the collection for his store. And as kind of a finder's fee, he gave me some of these little pint bottles of some of the vintage bottles. And he was kind enough to age them for me to let me know what they were. And he got me a bottle of 1981 from OBR, Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey, and a bottle from 1981 from Bourbon Supreme. Interestingly enough, both of these bottles are charcoal filtered for all of you rabid fans of Jack Daniels that think that charcoal filtering, otherwise known as the Lincoln County process, makes it illegal to call a whiskey a bourbon. Here is proof that Kentucky bourbons are sometimes charcoal filtered, just like Jack Daniels is, and still labeled as bourbon. So what I find interesting is that, these two bottles, they're both non-distiller produced. So we don't exactly know who the distillery is. I'm sure Brad probably knows off the top of his head. But this bottle is from Jim Beam from 1974. And I acquired this bottle, similar situation. Gentleman inherited it. He didn't drink old bourbon, so he let me have it. I've had old bottles of Wild Turkey. And whenever I taste them, there's something very interesting, and that is all Dusties kind of taste the same. And so if you don't know what I'm talking about, generally speaking, we refer to really old vintage whiskey as Dusties, dusty whiskey. Often there's an awful lot of dust on the top of the bottle whenever you find it. I'm going to set that aside and glue that back on later. And so these two are certainly not the same distillate. But somehow, when I nose them, I get leather on both whiskeys. In fact, every dusty whiskey I've ever tried has a leather, graphite, kind of a musty basement smell to it. I've even had a 1938 Stitzelweller that was a Weller product from the Stitzelweller distillery that's now defunct, that kind of made Pappy Van Winkle famous when they started releasing higher age releases of that. And it tasted that same sort of musty, leathery, funky. And so the question is, did this whiskey taste like this on release? And that modern manufacturing methods have caused whiskey to no longer taste like this? Or does whiskey change slowly in a bottle in a similar way, no matter what the distillery is that it came from? And I theorize, because I've researched this and no one can seem to explain what the degradation process is of whiskey. The only time I've ever been able to replicate this leather flavor or smell in a young whiskey was when I exposed it to an extreme amount of light. And so I had taken a clear bottle and had put it in a windowsill, and when I tasted it, it tasted like this graphite, musty, leathery flavor that I find across the board in all dusty whiskeys. And so that would seem to indicate that decanters, which light cannot penetrate because a decanter is painted all over, right? So no light's getting in here, that the decanter should not be exposed to light, and therefore if light is the culprit, that wouldn't be the flavor. But even in a decanter bottle like this one, I still get that leather musty flavor. And so since I'm tasting it across the board, since I'm tasting it regardless of who the producer is, even different mash bills, wheated mash bills, rye mash bills. I have to believe that this leather dusty flavor isn't something that would have been found in the original spirit upon release, but it's something that happens to whiskey when it sits in a bottle for a very long time, and I don't think that I can attribute it to light exposure. When I've talked to people from the industry, nobody seems to exactly know what the chemical reactions are that are happening that make this change in the whiskey. But most of us recognize that it is universal across the board, regardless of mash bill, regardless of producer. Now, what's very interesting about this is that quite often somebody will pour a glass of one of these old vintage whiskeys and go, oh my God, this is vintage wild turkey, 12-year age stated. This is the creme de la creme. This is the best, whiskey ever was, from the early 80s or the early 90s. And someone tastes that, and that introduction to that spirit will orient their mind to prefer that leathery, dusty flavor because they believe that that's what ultra premium whiskeys taste like. And I was doing a study where I was sending out samples of whiskey that was damaged and whiskey that was not damaged. And what I found is that people who worked in the industry who are currently involved in tasting new distillate and barrels as they age to determine when they're mature enough to be released to the public, they rated the whiskeys that had that leathery, dusty flavor low, but consumers who most of their experience was from tasting bottled whiskey and those who had been exposed to vintage bottles and told that that is the, premium creme de la creme, actually rated the damaged whiskey higher than the undamaged whiskey because their palates had been reoriented to see that flavor as an indication of premium. And so I hope you find that interesting. I love you guys. To be quite honest, the economy's been tough on everybody. We've had a lot of people that needed to drop out of Patreon for financial reasons. And for those of you who have stuck around, we truly, truly appreciate you. And we just want to say we love you and thank you. And we'll talk to you soon.